Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of The Formula, where we break down and explore the elements of achievement in world-class performers. I'm your host, Trevor Carlson. On this week's show, we have guest Corey Poirier, also known as That Speaker Guy. On this episode, we discuss how he became that speaker guy, where to start if you want to begin public speaking yourself, who the speakers are that he's learned from and that you can learn from as well. His new book that was the result of over 4,000 interviews. It's called The Book of How and Why. It sounds really interesting to me. I haven't had the opportunity to read it yet, but we'll definitely link that up in the show notes so you guys can check it out if it's something that sounds interesting to you. We also discuss his daily routine that sets him up for success on a daily basis. I've really got a few takeaways that I'm going to be implementing from this interview to help me become a better speaker. It kind of makes sense since I host a podcast. So I'm hoping that you can apply a few things to your speaking repertoire as well. So without further ado, let's get this thing rolling with Corey Poirier. Today's guest on this episode of The Formula is Corey Poirier. Corey is a professional speaker. He's known as That Speaker Guy. Corey, do you want to kind of go into or tell us a little bit about how you got into becoming a public speaker, or what that experience has been like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so, Trevor. So I took definitely an interesting path. So this question is I think, really a well-suited question because anybody I've shared this story with, speakers or not speakers, I haven't had one person yet say, oh yeah, that path, because it's not the norm. So when I say that, how I started out this journey is I was actually at a stage play in a fringe festival, and I wrote and directed this play, was totally not comfortable being on the stage at all. So I had no intention to be on the stage. One of the actors got injured on the way to the play, couldn't fulfill his duties within the play, and the whole script was written with the he needed that part. It was written with the intention to have that person and those lines. And so, of course, there's only one other person in the whole production that knows the lines, and that's the person who wrote it. So all of a sudden now, the person who doesn't want to be on stage, me, has to figure out a way to do this. And so what I did was I actually wrote myself a part. I switched the part a little bit, but I wrote it so that basically I would have my back to the audience. I had a wig on, and I was wearing a Triple H wrestling shirt so that I felt nobody would know it was me and I didn't have to look at the audience. And so I did this for the remainder of the play's run. And when it was done, I was like, oh, I wiped, the sweat off my brow. And I was like, wow, thank God it's finally over. But as I was thinking about this, I thought, I need to get more comfortable with this because the truth is nobody else is going to have the same, I'm going to say, passion for or method for sharing my lines or my work as me. And so I needed to find a way, I felt, to get comfortable being on the stage. So we're driving last night of the play. Play's over. We're driving down the road. One of the actors is in the car with me. He says, hey, dude, I saw this stand-up comedy workshop at the local university. Would you like to give it a try with me? And I said, that sounds absolutely terrifying. I'm in. Because you're going to face the fear. You got to face it head on. And so I went to this 2-week workshop. All we were taught was here's how you adjust the mic stand. And the guy who ran the workshop told us who his favorite comic was and why he loved him. That was pretty much our training to conquer what is considered, the number one fear in the world, public speaking. And so the third week we were kind of excited because we were going to watch people entertain us. And it was going to be like a clinic, and we were going to sort of study what they did really well so that way we would get a better feel for what it was like to be on the stage. And so what happened was we showed up that night about 5 minutes to 8, so 5 minutes to showtime. We're still looking around, and we turned to the guy who got us into this mess. His name was Guy. And I said, Guy, where are the entertainers? We were all wondering this, and he turned to us and said, you guys are looking at them. So we discovered with 5 minutes notice and zero material that we were intended to be the comics. So I ran to the bathroom to try to find the exit window, and there was no exit window in the bathroom. Came back out. 15 people had went to the workshop, paid, showed up, went through everything, showed up that night. 8 of them had walked out the front door. I've never seen them again. 7 of us stayed. I learned by going to a Toastmasters meeting that if you're going to face a fear like this, you're better to go first. So I jumped up on the stage when everybody's still debating at 10 after 8 who's going to go up on stage, launched into the joke that I thought was the best joke I ever told in my life, to dead silence. And then I jumped into the second best joke I thought I'd ever told in my life, still dead silence. And finally, this guy who I mentioned that got us into this whole thing, he called me over to the corner of the stage. He gave me a smuck in the back of the head and he said, "You idiot, we haven't even turned the mic on yet."
Oh no.
So this is how it all started. I actually still stayed up on stage, jumped once we had the mic on, jumped into my jokes again, thought the only reason they didn't laugh is because they didn't hear the material. But guess what? I told the same jokes again and they bombed again. But I actually left that night on a little bit of a high, even though I bombed horribly. And I said, I'm going back the next week and I'm going to crush it. And I went back the next week and I bombed again. And I went back and I bombed again. And I went, and you see where this is going. And so I spent like literally a year where I get like one laugh out of a 5 minute set, or, 3 or 4 laughs out of a 10 minute set, but I just kept bombing. And then what happened was I liked a lot about comedy, but there were elements I didn't like. And I saw somebody speaking and I recognized that maybe there was an actual career in this. And then I watched Tony Robbins speak after that, and I did some research and realized he was getting paid to speak. I had always thought he was just on the stage to promote his products, like his personal power product. And I thought that, just like I thought back when I was really young, that comics didn't get paid. I thought they were just there to promote the next movie because I was familiar with, say, Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy. And so ultimately, once I figured out that I could actually get paid to speak, everything changed because I had already been in business. I'd already been building a business career and then a sales career. So the speaking side, it actually made sense to me. And so what happened from there, to finish the story off, Trevor, is that I transitioned into speaking. I kept doing comedy, eventually stopped bombing so much, but I kept doing comedy, something like we figured out about 700 shows over a 9 year period. And but at the same time, I had launched my speaking career about the first year into comedy, and it just kept building from there. And so, if we talk about how did I get into it, there's the story of how it all started. And again, I haven't run into another speaker yet who told me that's how they got into the business.
That is an awesome but also terrifying story of how you got into public speaking. So if someone was to ask you for advice to where to get started in public speaking, would you tell them to sign up for uh, a stand-up comedy class and have them just go bomb a bunch of times until they figure it out, or where would you recommend that they start?
So I would say that what I did is not for the faint of heart, and a lot of people, myself included, I don't know how I stuck it out. I figured that, and I don't even know today if I were to do it all over again, if I would still proceed. We never know what we'd do, in the same circumstance. It would have probably only taken one little thing push me off the course for me to tap out. And so I certainly don't say that that's the best way to do it. I kind of liken that to being thrown to the wolves. And so, no, I would say, uh, I'll say I learned more about speaking in the stand-up comedy club trenches than anywhere else that I've ever spoken or spent time, whether it's on a stage or in a room. But at the same time, I don't think that's probably the best way to start because I feel a lot of people will either tap out or really what the big risk could be is that you think that the humor you're trying to tell will actually translate over to a corporate world, which it absolutely will not. And so I would say where I would tell somebody to start, and where I have told people to start, is go to Toastmasters, which I kind of mentioned in passing there, or join a Rotary Club and get speaking in front of a business audience in that capacity. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying go from being terrified of the stage, jumping on a stage, but go to, say, Toastmasters. And for those that are listening that may not have heard of it, essentially it's for the most part a nonprofit organization that helps people get more comfortable speaking in front of others. And so I would say seek out a local Toastmasters, go as a guest, watch other people share their icebreaker talk, which is like 2 minutes. Watch people actually bomb, even in their icebreaker talk. And nobody laughs at the other person for that reason, but it'll make you comfortable because you'll say, you know what, some of these people are the same place I am. Perfect scenario is you show up as a guest at a Toastmasters meeting and somebody else is there as a guest. You both join and you watch them go up and speak before you and you go, wow, they were at the same place as me. So that, first of all, that's one direction because not only will Toastmasters get you over the fear, but it'll the whole idea is it'll teach you the nuances. It'll teach you the how to get rid of the ums and ahs quicker. So it's a really good training ground. And the cool part is something like a Toastmasters is, I mean, my case, I think it was $55 for 6 months. So I get rid of my ums and ahs through Toastmasters, and for $5 a month as a paid speaker, that's pretty low investment, and
That's a good
definitely,
deal.
yeah, and you get a nice return on it. So I guess I would say start somewhere like that. There's so many other directions I would say from there, like watch speakers, hot, world class speakers, watch top TED talks, and start taking notes. What's working? What's not working? What do they all seem to have in common? I mean, I could almost bore you with all the different things you could do to get started, but I would say something like a Toastmasters, which gives you all of the grounding, or a program like, I have a program. There's a Dale Carnegie program. You'll spend a little more for those ones. They'll take you a little bit. It depends what your goal is. If you want to actually become a paid speaker, then Toastmasters might not get you there. It'll get you started. So I would say that's where I would start. And then, like I said, there's a whole bunch of little things like studying other speakers, reaching out to other speakers and asking them questions, all that kind of stuff. So hopefully that answers the question well.
Yeah, it definitely did. It gave me a few ideas on different places or different things I could go to, improve my speaking ability, because I feel like it's kind of important as a podcaster as well. But who's your go-to speaker that you reference their YouTube videos or their speeches to learn from?
Yeah, happy to share some different names. So, for instance, there's Sir Ken Robinson, who I'm kind of a fan of. He has a popular TEDx talk, and I'm going to say the name by memory, so hopefully I get it right. But I think it's How Schools Kill Creativity. So that's an amazing talk, and it's not just the fact that the content is amazing and the talk's amazing. It's you can learn a lot from his approach because he adds humor regularly. He switches gears and we're talking, I think, an 18-minute talk, but he switches gears often. He gets the audience engaged with questions. He adds humor. He shares relatable stuff. And so somebody like Ken Robinson would be a great example. But then if we go on the other end of the spectrum, I'll tell you who changed my actual presentation style in terms of even how I started presenting with PowerPoint is Steve Jobs. So I kind of went out there and read a bunch of studies about who the best presenters were. Of course, Tony Robbins came up over and over. Bill Clinton came up often, but Steve Jobs was always at the top of the list. And so I said, if I want to reframe my talks and figure out what I'm doing wrong and have more success, I need to study the greats. And so Steve Jobs kept coming up. So I went and I just dived into YouTube videos of Steve Jobs. And one of the things that it changed, which dramatically transformed the results of my talks, was even just the approach I used in PowerPoint. So instead of what I had been doing, which was bullet points, what Steve Jobs does is he did a lot of visuals. So he'd have a picture of the new whatever iPod, let's say, on a slide, and that would be the total slide, would just be a picture of the iPod. And then he knew the story that he was going to share from that. He had prepped it, what have you. So I realized that there's no reason, especially as a comic and a storyteller, that I can't have an image on the screen, whether it's a story about someone, I can have the image of them, whether it's a product or what have you. I can have that on the screen instead of 65 words and bullet points and the whole gamut that people are having to still read when I'm trying to move to the next slide. And so seeing what he was doing that way, I transformed my presentations overnight into visuals rather than text-based. And instantly I was getting, my feedback, if I was getting like a 80% approval or 75% approval rating, then it went to like 90% almost overnight. So I can say that was a game changer. And it still goes back to I started studying what Steve Jobs did. Even if you don't use a PowerPoint for the nature of your presentation, or even if you want to use bullet points because maybe you're in a world where you have to use financial figures, either way, studying somebody like Steve Jobs will teach you so many of the nuances that it takes to become the top of the top. So I would say Steve Jobs, Sir Ken Robinson, Tony Robbins, of course, Bill Clinton, I would add as well. So some of the people that are, and Zig Ziglar would be another one. So some of the people that are considered the greats, they sort of got there for a reason. And so I really believe I study new people that I see that are hitting the scene and are building big names like a Gary Vaynerchuk, but I definitely go back to sort of the usual suspects, if you will.
Right. Yeah, I've heard of all of those speakers before, but I didn't know that about Steve Jobs with his presentations or his PowerPoints. So that's something I'll have to go back and reference. So I imagine that there's like some type of process or maybe some rituals that you go through when you are preparing for, let's say you get an email and someone's like, hey, I want you to come do another TEDx or a TED Talk. What does that process look like for you when you find out you have a speaking engagement? up until you walk on stage?
So this is very interesting because we have a show called For the Love of Speaking, and it's a podcast that we do as a seasonal thing. All the episodes are under 7 minutes. We haven't done any interviews yet. It's a different type of show. But why I say it's interesting is we just launched season 2 yesterday, and my what I shared, my insight was preparation for your talk. So it's kind of timely as well. Interestingly, one of the key things I focused on in that sharing was about what we just talked about studying other speakers. So one of the things I'll do is I'll study other TEDx talks and TED talks, and I'll study them, mark down the nuances, kind of get myself back in that mind frame of what a really good talk looks like. And so some of the things I mentioned, I'll make notes of when they inject humor, how often they have between humor, do they make sure their stuff is relatable, how do they open, how do they close. And even though I've done this and I teach this, it's always good, I feel, to get back in your sort of genius zone, which is getting back in the mind frame. So the first thing I'll do is I'll study other speakers. So let's say, because there's two different answers. It depends if I have my talk ready. So if it's a talk I've delivered before, or if I'm starting from scratch. So if I had the talk ready, then I'd start studying other speakers. Let's say we're starting from scratch. So I decided what the talk's going to be on, but I haven't done anything yet with it. So what that would look like for me is the first place is I'd write down. So I have a thing called my spiderweb method. And what that looks like is I'll essentially draw a circle on a page. And let's say my talk was around customer service. So I'll write customer service in the center of the spider, and then I'll start building legs out from there. And the legs are my actual points in my PowerPoint. So I do this all by hand. I believe in starting with pen and paper. And so I'll write, let's say, systems. So customer service systems might be one of the legs. And so I'll build at least 3 legs if I want to have 3 points, let's say, in my PowerPoint or my talk. So I'll decide what those 3 points are around customer service. The reason I use the spider web is because it's a good brainstorming tool. I think other people call it mind mapping. And so I got it from the stand-up world, and we called it the spider method. And so I'll basically start with that. From scratch, I'll say, okay, I want my talk to be about this. That goes in the center. I'll decide the points. Those become the legs. And then once I've done that, then I'll take that to build out my presentation, my PowerPoint. So then I got to figure out what slide or image or what have you relates to that one point. And so that then becomes that slide. So I decide, let's say, 3 legs. Here's the order of them. And then so my slides, I'll basically start building out using those 3 points. And I have to make sure it has a really strong opening, a really strong close. Of course, I learned that from stand-up. And then I can't lose them in the middle. So I basically flush it out based on what's a strong opening, what's a strong close around that theme, and what are my 3 points. And then I build my slides based on that. And then the next stage is once I have slides ready, I know what my talk's going to be about, then I actually go through it with somebody else and get a feel for what I think I should eliminate. So then I start pulling out to make sure I'm basically bringing to the core essence of what this talk should be. And then from there, so this goes to if I already had a talk done. So what I would do once the talk is ready, then I basically start recording myself. Like when I'm driving around, I'll actually put on my voice memo on my phone. I'm not on my phone while I'm driving. I'll just set it down and I'll just basically go over my talk out loud. And I'll keep fleshing it out till I both have it memorized and also feel that it's strong. So I'll listen back to what I practiced. And then essentially from there, let's say if it was a TEDx talk, I might go for an audition. I should know my stuff by that point well enough that I'm going to be able to recite the portion I'm going to share because they won't get you to audition the whole talk usually. And then basically it's game time. So then I'll get to the event. I now have my talk ready. I practiced it enough so that I feel it's ready. And then it's a waiting game. And again, it doesn't have to be a TED talk. It could be for a conference too. Maybe I'm a part of a conference with 6 other speakers. So basically it's game time. I wait until my talk is up. And then the other side of my prep is probably 15 minutes before I'm to hit the stage. I'll kind of go into a bit of my own sort of meditation and take some time to breathe deeply. And then the last thing I do before I open my mouth to start speaking is I take a long enough breath that I'm not too excited or jumping too far into the talk, or my pacing's not too heavy and too fast. And then I dive in. So that's kind of like I say, I study others. I map it out. I figure out what the talk's going to be. I practice it over and over again, get it to the point where I know it backwards and forward. And then the cool part about that too, Trevor, is that not so much a TEDx talk where you're limited to say 18 minutes or 15 minutes and you're on a clock, but for a normal talk where I might have 45 minutes, what's really cool is I'll prepare it so it's 35 or 30 minutes. And then once I know it inside and out, then I'm comfortable with and okay to actually ad lib a bit. because I know the rest so well that if I get off track, I can pull myself right back. So
Yeah.
that's the other thing. Once I know it back and forward, then I'm comfortable to ad lib. But if I don't know it back and forward and I haven't memorized it well, then I really stick close to the script because ad libbing is dangerous. So
Right.
hopefully that gives you a feel for the approach I take.
Yeah, no, I definitely got a pretty good feel of that, and it's almost like the when you're talking about the ad libbing part, it's like what's the rule? I do, I took salsa dancing lessons this year for like 6 months, and the rule that kept getting brought up was I'd be like, well, those guys that are really good aren't doing anything that we're doing. They're like, well, you need to learn the rules so you can break them. So you need to,
Exactly.
yeah. So it sounds like you almost need to like have your talk down to the point where it's like you have your quote unquote rules memorized to the point where you can then, when you have a feel for the audience, you can then kind of add in the fun stuff after that.
Yeah, and one of the reasons, because somebody listening to this could say, this all sounds exciting, but also I'm terrified now about the idea of getting on a stage. Just a little FYI, based on interviews with thousands now of thought leaders, what I can tell you that I've learned, one of the biggest things I've learned is that, there's that whole statement of the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But what I've discovered that we really fear more than rejection, more than, the what if and all that kind of stuff, it's actually the unknown. So we don't know what's going to happen, and we're scared that it's bad. So why does somebody not want to get on the stage? They don't know. They might get a standing ovation, but they also might bomb. And it's that unknown that keeps most people away. So what I've learned is that if you know your talk inside and out so well that you could ad lib if you need to, there's few unknowns now. There might be the unknown, you don't know how the audience is going to react. But if you practice it inside and out, if you run it past it with other people, if you've done everything you could to prepare and you're saying 90% certain, that's going to get you on the stage a lot quicker than the person that it's all an unknown and all a variable. So I really believe too that's a side benefit to practicing it enough so that it makes it look like no work at all has gone into it.
I almost think that the whole bombing part, because I've definitely bombed on stage. Like anybody who knows me that's listening to this, are like, yeah, I saw you a few years ago. It was not pretty, but I think that's all part of the. Like, it's not. I mean, how can I say this in a way that somebody who hasn't bombed on stage would understand? But it's like it's not as bad as you think. Like the world doesn't end when you bomb, right? It's just everything is fine. You mean you're a little embarrassed and maybe you're like go home and kick yourself a little bit, but it's not the worst thing in the world. You can always bounce back. And I wanted to say, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say absolutely. I agree 100%. And I told you about that bombing. I mean, you can't get much more of an example of bombing than starting with the mic turned on and in front of everybody, and then actually restarting and still bombing. Right, after they thought, okay, well, now he's gonna have the confidence. Now he's gonna realize we couldn't hear him, and you still bomb. I mean, so I bombed twice basically within 5 minutes.
That takes a lot of courage, man. I mean, I got to give you props for that. I don't know if I would go back on stage after I'd bombed once. I'd be like,
But here,
I'm good.
But what the key thing, what you just said is, but guess what? I'm still here to talk about it. Once I learned that after that night, after bombing twice, the worst that could possibly happen to me happened, and I still was alive, and I still was able to say, you know what? Here's what I could have done differently. And so for me, like what you just said is so profound in the sense that once you realize that you're not going to die, typically, if you're doing something like speaking in public, that changes everything for you.
I wish, I keep, well, from doing this podcast, I've interviewed a lot of people that have some great experiences, and I keep hearing like all these different types of lessons over and over again, and this is one of them. No matter what the thing is, whether it's speaking or I've had artists on, painters, podcasters, Olympic athletes, it's the ability to fail or be okay with failing and like getting back up and doing it again. I mean, it's kind of cliche where you're like, just you fall down, you get back up again. It's like, but when you haven't fallen down yet, it's a lot scarier to fall down because you don't know what it's like to get back up. But
Absolutely.
yeah, and it's just interesting that it's something where it's like, I almost feel like that in some scenarios you're discouraged from failing. You're like, well, if I fail, I might lose my job. If I go give this sales presentation or this sales talk and I fail, it could be bad for my career, but in reality, it's probably gonna be fine, but it keeps coming back to that lesson, like, every no matter what happens, as long as you can get up and try again, that's really all that and you can take something away from it that you learned. I think that's all that really matters.
Absolutely.
Anyways, I'll get off my soapbox and stop ranting
No,
about
that's
that.
all good.
But let's talk more about just speaking as a skill. Why do you think that being able to give like a talk or having public speaking as something that you're good at, why do you think that's important?
To me, it all centers back around to impact and influence. There's, in my experience, as somebody who's worked with a lot of different platforms, broadcasting and authorship as a form of a way of getting a message out. There's nothing that comes with greater influence and allows for greater impact than I'll just say it this way, a talk well done rather than a job well done. But a talk delivered in the right way at the right time. Words are probably the most powerful weapon in the world, and hopefully we use them for good. But it's the power to influence and impact that comes along with that. If you think about those great talks like Martin Luther King's talk, or Steve Jobs' commencement address at Stanford, or Obama's Hope Talk. I mean, those talks really transformed a generation, if you will, and transformed lives. And just from a person speaking their words to in the right way at the right time. And so I guess my answer would be it's because of the power they have to influence and impact that few other things can offer. And that can be as simple or as small as helping you get a job that maybe a coworker that's not willing to speak up can't get, maybe having your ideas heard at a meeting, or having your ideas heard if you're trying to help for a cause or a fundraiser, if you're trying a grassroots movement. It helps you with leadership so that people will follow you rather than wanting you to follow them, and on and on. So I really believe it comes back to the fact that it's the most powerful way to influence others, to impact others, and to get your message heard.
Yeah, I think those are all things that we could all be we could all benefit from. And it's interesting that I don't know if that's something that people necessarily think about when they consider public speaking as a skill, but the impact you can have on other people, or how you can deliver your message in a way that has an effect on other people. So I'd like to transition right now to talk about your book a little bit that you just released. Do you want to tell me a little? We kind of covered it a little bit in the pre-call, but do you want to tell me a little bit about your new book that just came out, and what, if one of our listeners decide to pick it up, what they could potentially learn or take away from reading it?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's called The Book of Why and How, and and I guess the subheader is Discover the Timeless Secrets to Meaning, Success, and Abundance. And really, for me, the two books changed my life. I share this often, and it's always the same two books. First book I ever read in my life, I was actually 27 years of age, so I didn't start reading at a young age. So I know you don't have to be young when you start learning. And I say that because I know a lot of people that were readers right from the time they were 6 or what have you. And but yeah, so I started reading at 27. First book I ever read, cover to cover, was Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Second book I ever read was Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. And so those two books changed my life. I'm an avid reader now. And so in putting together this book, even though this isn't my first book or trip around the rodeo, I decided that for whatever reason, this book was, I'm proud of all the other books, but this book was the book. It was the book that I wanted to put out for the longest time to sort of recreate what those two books did for me. So I went and reread those books before I started writing this one to get in that mindset. I wanted the books to have that feel of timelessness. When you read Think and Grow Rich, when you read How to Win Friends, they're both written in 1936, 1937, and they both feel like they could have been written yesterday. At the same time, the way they spoke in the books was a different sort of feel as well. And so I actually wanted to get into that mindset when I started writing this. So first of all, it's written from that mindset and written to ideally be a book that transforms somebody's life. In terms of what's in the book, in terms of the core content, the why part in the name relates to helping people find their purpose or their passion or their calling, so their why. And then the secondary part of that, which is kind of the first section of the book, is why it should be you, meaning why you rather than somebody else, why now is the right time, and why not be you. So in other words, telling yourself, you know what, there's no reason it couldn't be me. So it's first of all, it's how to find your why. We go through that. We teach you through exercises in the book. But then the follow up to that is all the reasons that you should do it. So it's kind of, I guess, the motivator after the how to. Second section is called, well, it's built around thriving, and it's built around these timeless secrets I've learned after all these interviews, and it's basically the like 5 secrets I've learned plus a bonus one that I've learned during all these interviews that these top achievers use to sort of hack or shortcut the process of getting to the top, or at least having more meaning in what they're doing. And then finally, the third section is around meaning. So it's called Enlightened as a section, and basically it's about bringing more meaning and purpose into all the stuff that you do, whether that's your personal or professional life. And then there's a bonus section, which is basically close to 400 quotes from all these thought leader interviews we've done over the years. And when I put these quotes together, even, I wanted the quotes to be such that one of these quotes on its own, just one of the 400, could change a life. And so to back up and prove that that was the case, what we did is we did a bunch of Facebook Lives when we launched the book with people that provided the quote, discussing their quote, and we actually had to stop every one of them. We planned to do it for less than a half hour, and everyone went to the half hour or more solely around the idea of one quote. And some of the quotes were one sentence. So that to me was the backup that just the thought of one of these quotes could change a life. So the book basically gives you those 3 sections I mentioned and all those bonus quotes. And that's sort of the book in a nutshell, if you will. And we mentioned as well, Trevor, we're actually re-releasing here really shortly, coming up in roughly the 3rd week of January. So if people want to know in the interim more about it, they can go to thebookofwhy.com.
That sounds like an awesome book. I'm gonna have to go check that out. I think as soon as it's available on Amazon, I will definitely get one sent my way. So you kind of covered one of the last questions that I asked with your 2 books there. So that will knock that one off the list. But this kind of brings us to the last part of our show, which is I just ask our guests a couple regular questions just to kind of get an idea of, what kind of goes into their day, or what inputs have they had that have helped them to build the career that they have now. So my question for you is, what do you do on a daily basis to make sure that you are operating at the highest level you can, at the top of your game, the most productive level, whatever term you want to use?
So for me, this is one of those, I'll share it actually as one of the timeless secrets that I've learned with these interviews. And so when I say these interviews, I've done over 4,000, and what I've done essentially, similar to what Napoleon Hill did, is I've tried to dissect what is the wisdom out of these nuggets, and then also what are the common traits. So if it's 4,000 thought leaders, what do 3,950 of them do? And they have it in common, but yet most people don't do it. And so that's what I was trying to distill and get to with these timeless secrets. So the thing that I do every day relates to a timeless secret I discovered during this process, which is the power of saying no. And so when I say that, what I'm driving at is there's a philosophy. Some people say, say yes to everything and figure out how to do it later. But what I found is most of the top thought leaders do the exact opposite. What they do is they figure out what to say no to, and they basically say no to almost everything so that they can say yes to the few things that will move the needle. So what I do is I basically try to have a system. Well, I have it, but I try to use that system every day to remind me, okay, this is a no, this is a no, this is a no, so that this can be a yes. And so I highly recommend people figure out what are no's to them and what are yeses to them. And once they get really good at that, you'll be able to figure out how these thought leaders crush so much in a day. They get so much done in seemingly little time. And really comes back to the fact that they're not trying to juggle everything, and they're not multitasking. They're single tasking, and they're trying to focus on the few things that will rock the world versus the many things that will basically take over your world.
Yeah, I've heard that concept get brought up so many times between guests and some of my personal favorite books, like The One Thing or Deep Work by Cal Newport. I believe that's the author's name. And they both just kind of touch on that, like what you said, that focus, that ability to, like one of them is just like time blocking to remove distractions from your day, like taking 3 to 4 hours and not having anyone or anything interrupt whatever that most important creative thing that you're working on is. So it kind of sounds like from the 4,000 people that you talked to, a lot of them said some of the same things.
Yeah, and I will add as well, just a little how to, if you will, Trevor, because when I listen to interviews, I'm always like, but how can I do that? Don't leave me hanging and
Right.
leave me on my own to figure this thing out that I've struggled with already. How I made the change essentially is I had to figure out, so I recommend people do this. I had to figure out what my mission statement was, my personal mission statement. And so it took a long time. And I say it took a long time. I had the core of it within an hour, but then I had to keep reframing it. And so what I figured out that my mission, my what I do, my purpose, what have you is to always be donating, motivating, inspiring, educating, and entertaining. And so essentially those five things are what makes up my genius zone, if you want to call it that, when I'm doing what I'm meant to be doing. And so here's how I decide what I say yes and no to. Once I figured out what I need to be doing to always be on purpose, then it was easy because I could actually say, okay, this thing that just came onto my plate, is this one or two of those? Is this zero or is this five or four? And the ones that were, of course, four or fives became the easiest yeses you'll ever say. The ones that were two or less became really easy nos. And then once you get to a three or something, then maybe it's okay, I'll sit on this and think about, do I want to take this on? But by having something to pit it against, which was, how many of these has it helped me do? So if it's not going to help me donate, if it's not going to help me inspire, if it's not going to help me educate, basically, if it's not going to help me do any of these things, then it's going to be an easy no. So that's how I use it. That's the system I have.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to write that down and try that out because it almost sounds like you basically made a list of all the things that were important to you or would move the ball forward, and everything else was just like, okay, everything else is just an easy no.
Absolutely, that's exactly what I did.
So we already covered the books, which I've read both of those. That Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. That was the first quote unquote self-help book that I ever read, and I still have that first copy. I've reread it a few times, and I think I have just like so many notes and so many pin marks and scratch marks on so many pages. So I will double down on that recommendation and say that should be a required reading for anybody just going through high school or early college or taking a new step on a new journey or project, just to kind of get your head right, make sure you're on the right path. So I want to. Oh, sorry. Did you have something to say?
Oh, no, I'll echo and absolutely third it, even though I started the process.
Yeah. So now we've doubled and tripled down. So just go buy the book and read it. You'll thank us later. Corey, I want to say thank you for taking the time to show up on the episode today. Is there I know you already talked about your book and some stuff that you have going on your website coming up. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience about, and is there a message that you would like to leave the listeners with?
Yeah, for sure. So, Trevor, I'm all about value rather than selling. So, just like the book, I mentioned that it's not even available as we're, for depending on when a person's hearing this. So I'm definitely not trying to sell anybody on anything, but I will say I do get a lot of requests and questions about how can I launch a speaking career or how can I secure and deliver a TEDx talk. And so we decided a few years ago to open up a program to help people do that. But what's really cool is for people that want to learn more about the speaking world and get some training, but maybe aren't ready to jump into the program. We actually set up at thespeakingprogram.com a place that they can essentially jump on there, join our tribe. They'll get a bunch of free insight from our newsletter, but more importantly, it gives them access to some free video training as well. So if somebody says, I want to learn a bit more about the speaking world or go dive a bit deeper into what Corey was talking about here, that's where I'd sort of send people. Again, both of those things, the book, not available right now, depending on when they're hearing it, and the speaking program, you can jump in and check out the stuff for free. So I'm not saying, come and buy anything from me, but if it speaks to you after you jump into those things, of course, we'll be able to let you know. And you can reach out to us certainly as well to see how you can learn more. But the other side is, more importantly, a message that I'd like to leave. I really think that the message I'd like to leave is that for people is that you need to be working on purpose. So first of all, if you're not working on purpose, you need to shift gears, because we mentioned it a couple times during this interview, but the importance of your why or your calling or your passion. But what I've discovered, and by the way, this is the number one timeless secret, is that the highest of achievers are all working on purpose. They found their calling, they found their passion, and that's how they're spending their time. So I would leave people with the message that if you're not working on your purpose and it's not your calling, you need to shift gears. And, so the challenge sometimes is people say, well, I haven't found my purpose yet. and I have an exercise for that too, but we don't have enough time for that today. But maybe you'll bring me back on the show later and I can share that. But what I will say is, figure out what it is that you love doing, you wanted to do when you were a kid, you would do if money wasn't an issue. Make that list, figure out the steps you need to take to do it, and take those steps. It might take you 2 or 3 months to find your calling if you haven't found it already. But we had Robin Sharma on the show, the Monk Who Sold His Ferrari author, and he shared that a study that something like only 5% of people will discover their calling or their passion in their lifetime. And so if most people go their whole life without discovering it, and yet the benefits of living with passion they're numerous. You can't even count them on your hands. If that's the case, then isn't it worth 2 or 3 months if it takes you that long to go through a little exercise to find your passion? So that's a long answer basically to come back around and say, if you haven't found your calling, you need to. And if you have found your calling, you know what I'm talking about. So if you have found your calling, I'll give you a second one. And that's essentially, I would say, every day, get up and find a way to motivate yourself, whether that's getting onto a Facebook page like Zig Ziglar's and reading a quote there, or whether that's reaching out to somebody you know and having a powwow with them. But find a way to make sure that you are motivated each day. And if you are, then go find your passion if you haven't found it. That's the two things I would leave people with as they must do's if they haven't already done.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is a wrap for this week's show. Thank you for tuning in this week, and a big thanks to Corey for taking the time to sit down and share his experiences with me. If you want to check out the show notes, you can find links to Corey's book, and we also threw in a link to his TED Talk, or one of his TED Talks that he's given. So go ahead and check that out. It's pretty awesome. Really enjoyed this interview, so the TED Talk is definitely worth your time. Now, if you have any ideas for any topics or guests that you would like to hear about on the show in 2018, feel free to shoot me an email at trevor at helixacademy.co. That's all for this week, and I look forward to you tuning in next week. Thanks, everyone.